To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep, no more. Okay, guys, yeah. So remember that while you're preparing for your IOC, you also need to memorize your Hamlet quotes, or you're running in the family quotes if you want to be cool and abstract and talk about alcoholism or whatever happens in RITF. But so today I picked the poem Tinder, and this poem originally, so basically I had my 20 minutes. The first minute I was just eating fruit, so I had to add a minute to the timer. And then I was saying I could not really develop arguments, so I was planning to just go line by line through the poem. And if you think that's an option, I know someone who did it. And so, well, they didn't actually do it for their real thing, because their real thing is not until Monday. But they went through line by line for their IOC, their mock IOC. So it's possible, but make sure that you relate back to your thesis. As long as you have a thesis, as long as you can tie it all up together and make some insightful points, because it's harder to do that when you go line by line. It's hard to make connections between things. So, Tinder from a northern horde. I never prepare my introductions for these. I just prepare my thesis, my arguments, and my annotations. So, let's start the 8-minute timer now. Tinder from a northern horde is a poem by Seamus Heaney, and the entire poem itself uses this very conspicuous imagery related to the idea of a fire and as an extended metaphor. And in this case, this idea, this type of diction that is so prevalent in the poem is actually an allegory for the troubles and the resistance, the ideas of the Catholic Irish protesters, and how their ideologies, their dogmas can ultimately be compared to a fire. And it's almost as if there's a journey, a progression of ideas throughout this poem. And there are three main parts that you can divide the poem into when the tone shifts. And this contributes to my first argument, which is the idea that the characters in Tinder, the speaker is like a collective, using the pronoun we. The whole group does not belong in where their current state is. And the reason why is because the way the tone and the mood is set in the poem, is the fact that taking into consideration the way that the tenses are used. The second part, by stanza 6, there's a change, because at first it uses past tense. However, the past tense from stanza 6 to 8 look further back into time, and then the last 3 stanzas talk about the present. However, in all 3 of these, throughout the whole poem, there's this idea of the entire livelihood being centered around the fire. But how the fire is dimming. And the fact is that the speaker is desperate. In the first line, they pick flints. They are still being selective, but then they realize in the next line that they're pale and dirt-veined, that this is not their optimal habitat, that they're not supposed to be here. And there are often many examples of alliteration as a sound device. In stanzas 2, there's so small. In stanza 3, there's history and home. In stanza 5, there's stone on stone. And all of these support the rhythm, but they also continue to have this idea, along with the rhyme scheme and the couplets, that there's a continual striking sound. And this is the fact that each strike is different, but no matter what, they're still ineffective because of the use of slant rhyme by Heaney. And in the second stanza, there's actually an interesting allusion to Heaney's first poem, Digging, mentioning the small finger and the thumb. In Digging, the poem, it refers to a pen uh, sitting between the finger and the thumb and resting. However, in this case, it's aching, the flint that is there, because they're not. This continual striking of the fire is a process that actually damages both into the mind and the person physically. There is pain, and this contributes to the idea of how there is never a rest and how it's always a consistent struggle. The juxtaposition of the word cold, the use of diction cold in the third stanza, compared to all the other mentions of the poem in the flame and the habitat itself, the tundra, the cold tundra, this juxtaposition is meant to symbolize how important the fire is to the people who are trying to make it. However, the fire is also described as a cave mouth flame. This connotes this idea of regression, how as they are cavemen and they're being exiled from their home. History and home as an alliteration means that history and home are synonymous, that what they identify as home is a part of the past. And this leads me to my second argument, that rather than being nostalgic of the past, they're actually the characters are actually being regretful. And the fact is that although there are many examples of how they're not being able to strike a flame in the poem, especially in the first 6 stanzas, when we move on to the 7th, 8th, and 9th stanzas, which are in fact couplets, we can identify the fact that in the past there was many images such as charred linen. In this use of imagery and figurative language, it brings to mind the idea of burning things down. And this list, tinder, charred linen, and iron, it's just so repetitive, the imagery, the use of diction in this poem. There's so many words that are repeated. Flint is repeated 3 times, iron is repeated 2 times, strike is repeated 2 times, and all of this, along with the idea of the consistent couplets, brings to mind the idea of how the ideas that are contained within these Irish resistance fighters, no matter what, it's still consistent. Although they may be feeling regret, it's not for the right reasons. They're feeling regret because they haven't won, that their violence has not paid off, that even in their dead igneous days, this idea of the volcanic rock bursting out of bursting like lava, even then, it wasn't enough for them to win. However, Heaney uses this as an ironical situation to really show how extreme the ideas of these fighters were. And the use of the word now to begin stanza 10 or whatever that is it really gives you a sense of time, and it solidifies the poem as understanding that there hasn't been that much time passing through, that even though that because they're red-eyed, they have no rest, that they continue to cultivate these evil ideas inside of their head, and they continue to be angry instead of seeking peace. And that is the final conclusion that we can make about this poem with the last line: cast-offs, the emotional state, scraps their living, nail the lack of a habitat, and canine with the tundra. Considering all of this, they still do not see their own faults. And that's my 8 minutes up. I felt that I was really able, you're really able to just make ideas up in the moment. And it really sounds, as I said, insightful. Or you can use another synonym to sound even smarter, like shrewd, sagacious. There are many, yeah, so it's really, this poem is really, there's so many, they keep repeating the same words over and over, and at first glance you may be frustrated that there's not much to talk about, but you can use this to your advantage. And the ideas in here, I talked about the Irish conflict, and I believe that is what the purpose of the poem was, but in general, there's so many variants you can, and so many different ways you can approach this poem in solidifying whatever ideas you have. And I might have contradicted myself at a few points. I said that they're regretful. Oh yeah, and then I developed on that. When I first stated my second argument that they're regretful, I was panicking because I realized, oh wait, then if I just talked about how they weren't regretful, how they weren't changing, so then I twisted the idea to say that they were regretful, but in the wrong way. And then the marker will give you extra marks. Perhaps I could have talked more about really they used a rhetorical question here. There are more devices I could have mentioned. I could have stayed more on this idea of the rhyming, because this rhyme scheme and this structure is really special to this poem, Tinder. I really hated this poem at first, but now I like it after spending 10 minutes with it. Well, wish you luck.